Hello, my name's Roseleen Cowie. I work for Child Bereavement UK. I'm a team lead there, and we support children who have been bereaved and parents who have been bereaved of a child. And I'm here this morning with 4 panelists, and so we're each going to introduce ourselves. Perhaps if we go round, Jane.
Hello, I'm Jane Harris. It's an absolute honour to take part in this because this is something we need to get more comfortable about. My son Joshua died in 2011 and my life changed immediately in the blink of an eye, but I'm a therapist and a filmmaker and have set up a charity called the Good Grief Project with my husband and partner Josh's dad, which runs active and creative grief retreats and makes film about grief.
Sarah, would you like to go next?
Hello everyone, as Jane said, it is a great honour and a privilege to be here. So my name is Sarah Turner. I'm a lecturer in English at Coventry University, and I work with Jeanette Littlemore on a project funded by the True Colours Trust. And as part of this project, we have been interviewing bereaved parents who have lost a child at any age to whatever cause. And the idea of our project is that we're especially interested in the language that parents use to talk about and describe their experience. We come from a kind of linguistics tradition where we sort of believe that the language that people use to talk about their experiences can give us real kind of insight into what they're experiencing and give us a sort of better understanding of what they're going through. And we think that that understanding is absolutely crucial to support better care. So we're interested in sort of facilitating better care from healthcare workers, from the police, from the funeral industry, from pretty much anyone who bereaved parents might come into contact with.
Thanks very much, Sarah. Jeanette?
Hi, I'm Jeanette Littlemore, and I'm a professor of linguistics at Birmingham University, and I'm working with Sarah on the project, as Sarah said, sponsored by the True Colours Trust. And in addition to what Sarah said, so we're looking at the language that people use when they're describing the experiences of the bereavement, with a view to sort of better understanding the process to allow people to help and support people through it. And we're also asking them about how they feel about the communication they've received with those who are there to support them. So not just healthcare professionals, but also funeral directors, the people you'd normally expect, but also we've had very unusual references to people who you might not expect, like help from surprising quarters, like very, very supportive florists, for example, or other people involved in the process. So it's been a very rich project. We've had the privilege to talk to a number of people who've been through the experience.
And Fiona, would you like to introduce yourself, please?
Yeah, so I'm Fiona Corliss. I'm mum to Ripley, who passed away in 2017 following a 9-month course of treatment with acute myeloid leukemia. And following that, I've set up a charity called Ripples of Compassion that looks at supporting parents specifically that have experienced the death of a child, around bereavement support and mental health support and grief support.
Thank you. We're going to start us off with a trailer for a film that Jane was involved in making, and it's called A Love That Never Dies.
Maxie? Mac?
Yeah?
Some people might think you're off your rocker.
Time for dinner! Okay.
But I had a friend that told me that when you're a bereaved mother, you get a wide latitude for craziness. And I always took comfort in that if anyone felt that it was unhealthy, I could just say, I'm a bereaved mother, what do you expect?
This is Jesse. This is his namesake. Within our family, we just decided after he passed away that somebody's kid should carry on the name.
When Josh first died, I didn't want to hear about anybody else's grief. Give me a break. I couldn't have done. I just could not have heard beyond my own pain.
The thing about losing a child is it has a sort of nightmare quality to it. It's just like a loss of identity and a confusion and just a sense of disbelief. My son Josh is dead.
The first time I laughed, I thought what a horrible person I was to laugh when my child had died. I didn't want to enjoy anything or eat the foods that he liked or do anything because he couldn't do it.
My grief is sacred. My love for my son is sacred.
The night Jordan died, we were laying there in bed and she looked at me and she said, Daniel, this is not good for our marriage. Statistically, people who lose children don't stay together. Statistically.
I screamed out at one point, just because your kid died doesn't make you queen over everyone else. You know, the rest of us don't have to bow down and take your shit because your kid's dead.
And the self-destructive bit, what's that about for you?
Wanting to die. Just wanting to die. Anything to stop the pain.
Everybody seemed to struggle with this same question of how to fit in. And I kept thinking, isn't this mad? We're bereaved parents and yet we are desperately trying to fit in.
You have to come to grips with your helplessness around it. No one can take it away. You can't bypass it.
I mean, you read about this in the grief books. Lean into the grief. And I never knew what the heck that meant. But I think I'm starting to figure it out.
Each stage along the way I've had moments. There's a bittersweetness always present because Josh isn't here. I want him standing beside me and I want to be able to give him a big squeeze and a big cuddle and feel his big tall body and, give it a hug.
Jane.
Yes.
That is a very moving trailer to a very moving film. And I wonder what it was that prompted you to feel it was important to make that film.
Yes, so soon after Joshua died, like every bereaved person knows, you have to prepare a funeral, which is something that no parent ever thinks they're going to do for a child. And the next year or two were very much caught up in managing our grief, trying to move forward. We actually became involved in a wonderful peer-to-peer support group called the Compassionate Friends as well, and made a film for them called Say Their Name. But we then found that in a way we represented people's worst nightmares, and people were sort of shying away from us. They didn't want to mention Josh's name. They didn't feel comfortable being alongside us. And we began to feel more and more isolated and decided that we were going to actually do the road trip we planned to do before Josh had died, but do it with a view to making a documentary, a sort of homage to his life, and to learn from other bereaved parents what it was like to live on after the death of your child. Because as every bereaved parent knows, you often think you can't survive it. So for us as filmmakers and me as a therapist, it made absolute sense to carry on doing what we do. And so we drove from one side of America to the other, interviewing bereaved parents who were queuing up to take part. But our goal was actually to share stories, personal stories, lived experience, open up conversations, ask people the questions that they were terrified about asking us, for fear maybe they might remind us that Josh was dead. Well, of course you don't forget, do you? So in a way, the actual goal was to make something that's intolerable and agonizing a little bit more normalized, so that in a way we could have conversations that would help others who maybe couldn't do the sort of thing that we could do. We were able to do it, so we thought we'll do it. And A Love That Never Dies is our feature documentary that we opened in Leicester Square in 2018 to an audience of over 200 people, which in itself was pretty staggering, because when we said we were going to make the film, people said, well, nobody's going to want to watch a film about the grief for your son. I mean, who would want to? And of course, we did wonder. And it's always difficult, as everyone here on this panel today knows, to share stories. It's always difficult, as everyone on this panel knows, to talk about our dead children. And I say dead because he's not lost. My darling Josh is dead. It's so hard. You want to keep that story private. You want to protect them, but you also know that you have to open up. Otherwise, the language never gets any easier. And in a way, you remain isolated and alone. So we do it because we can, and we do it as a tribute to every bereaved parent out there who may feel they don't have a voice.
And it is a very worthwhile film. You talk about the language and how important it is to use the right language. I wonder, Sarah and Jeanette, maybe you can say something about the research that you've been doing and what you have found.
Well, I think one of the things we found very much echoes with what Jane said about people feel that their friends and people they come into contact with, maybe parents of siblings at the school, don't want to talk to them about it because they feel that it's it's almost like a taboo topic, and the idea that you might suddenly remind someone that their child has died, whereas when you go through it, you experience it every day, all the time. It's not like you've forgotten, and that came out a lot with the people who we interviewed. And then also this idea of not talking about a child who's lost, that the child is dead, and having the confidence to say that and to talk about it in those very direct terms. I think this is something that a number of the people we spoke to, this came out again and again. Yeah.
The isolation as well, that was definitely a topic that a lot of the parents we interviewed talked about, that they would find friends and family, possibly by virtue of just not knowing how to communicate with them anymore, avoiding them entirely, or in some cases, at the school gates, just sort of literally distancing themselves, almost as if some sort of strange superstitious belief that what befell them would then happen to that person, which of course isn't the case, but of course made their grief journey all the more difficult because the people who would have supported them started to fall away. And a lot of people mentioned that this was due to the kind of taboo that we have around grief and bereavement more generally in society, but specifically I think child bereavement and child loss, that we just do not know how to talk about it, and that makes it so much more difficult.
Does that resonate, Fiona, with your experience?
Yeah, very much so. So for us, Ripley was our only child, and at the point at which she was diagnosed with cancer, was a couple of weeks before her second birthday. She was the only grandchild in our family as well. And she was, to be honest, one of the only children amongst our group of friends. So whilst everyone was really supportive, we had loads of support through the 9 months that we went through treatment with her in the hospital. And for a few weeks after we came back, we had time at the hospice with her. So we had a week with her after she died, leading up to the funeral. And then we had kind of people around for the week after the funeral. And then after that, it was kind of, right, you're on your own, carry on. But yeah, I think it very much echoes that what Jane was saying is that you kind of represent everyone else's worst nightmare. So even if they want to help, you're kind of a constant reminder for them that actually horrible things happen in the world. And even if you're there and they want to help, that fear for them is much easier if you can avoid that, if you don't have to address that. So being that reminder for people is quite tricky. And you can see that on people's faces when you talk to them. So I've had quite a lot of people asking me how many at work, well, you don't have children because you're commuting to work, or making assumptions around things. And I'm now able to say, actually, I do have a child and she's died. But when very early on in my grief, I wasn't able to do that. And that felt really hard because you're the person that's then kind of showing and highlighting people that actually children do die in this world. And you have to deal with their reaction on top of trying to deal with your grief and being able to explain to somebody that your child died. Like, I don't need to deal with your reactions as well. I need you to comfort me, not me to comfort you. And I think quite often I find that I'm the one that's then kind of comforting the person after I've told them that my child's died, rather than what you would hope and expect of that being the other way around.
And that's very much the experience of the parents that we support. So alongside that sort of response of not wanting to go there, I wonder what people have found have been the expectations of other people. Yes, Jane?
I was just going to say to Fiona first how sad I am, because, you know, to lose your only child is beyond my imagination. You know, I'm very lucky, I have other children. But when you lose your only child, and when the rest of the family lose their only grandchild, it's even more difficult. And I think that, you know, everybody is so well intentioned, but as Fiona will know, like we know, people are terrified. I mean, in a time of COVID, if you think about contagion at an unconscious level, people do actually think this is catching. They don't know they think that, but they're very well intentioned and they want to make it better. Now, we know firsthand, and I know as a therapist, that being powerless is one of the hardest things for everyone, including doctors, including the police, everyone. Mm-hmm. And one of the best ways to move forward after the death of a beloved person, in the wrong order of things, is to deal with your powerlessness to help. Because in actual fact, the most helpful thing you can do is recognize it's not for fixing. It can't be mended, but it can be supported and it can be tolerated. And as Fiona no doubt has experienced, you know, people want to make it better. They can't bear to look into your eyes and see your pain because of their own emotional discomfort. Mm-hmm. So as a therapist, I would say we have to all get more comfortable with it. But as a bereaved mum, what I would say to people is just be. You don't have to say the right thing, but don't allow your discomfort to come out with cliches, talking about language like maybe he or she's in a better place, or as my GP said to me, well, some things are meant to happen. Now, my GP is very well intentioned, as are all my friends, but people are paralyzed by the excruciating nature of death in the wrong order of things. And I suppose I feel a duty, not just to myself and my own physical and mental well-being, but to every bereaved parent I've ever met, to speak out because I can. I don't necessarily like it, but I can. I know how to, because it's not okay to say to somebody who's just lost their child, maybe it was meant to happen. Or with suicide, it's even worse. Well, at least they're not in pain anymore. I mean, imagine what that does to a bereaved parent, a bereaved mother who's already got the stigma. You know, it's even more immense, isn't it?
Sarah, I can see that you're, you know, very much wanting to come in there.
Just to speak to what Jane said there, we did have one parent tell us that she had been told by one of her friends that her child was now an angel. And she told us that the next person who said that was going to find themselves becoming an angel as well, which I thought was an absolutely wonderful way of expressing that. But I mean, that was certainly something that was reflected in a lot of the sort of interviews that we held, where parents were just saying, look, I don't want anyone to fix it because it can't be fixed. And actually, depending on where they kind of were in the process of grief, some of them were expressing views of sort of, you know what, actually, even if it could be fixed, I wouldn't want it to be, because I actually need to feel this pain, and I actually need to go through this as part of my love for my child. But that all I really want is for somebody to sit with me and say, this is awful. This is the worst thing that will ever happen to you. I don't know what to say. I don't know what to do. I'll just be here. And that, as you were saying, Jane, I think that is very, very difficult for people to do, because it taps into their own fears of, you know, awful things happening for no reason, or for their own fears of mortality, or their own fears for their own children. But that is ultimately the best thing that can be done, according to the parents that we spoke to.
I think that's right, Sarah, because if you think about it, there's an awful lot of pressure on bereaved couples as well. You know, I know myself and Jimmy, Josh's dad, I mean, we were told couples split up. And one of the reasons we made our film together as a couple was that we wanted to say, don't impose that on us. That's not true. Relationships need working on. And actually the death of a child or any trauma adds pressure to a marriage or a partnership. But relationships and trauma needs to be addressed. So, you know, it's like self-fulfilling prophecies. A lot of couples that we interviewed would say, allegedly, we're going to split up. We're really frightened. We're at risk. And we'd say, well, you're not, because if you keep talking and you find a language to communicate, you will get through it. And actually, when you think about it, I mean, some couples might have been going to split up way before their child died, but it just took the lid off things. We have to work at all our relationships, and that's tough. It's bloody hard work, and it hurts.
Fiona, I wonder when your little girl died, whether that had a big impact on your relationship.
So yes, I think what was tricky for us was we'd had 9 months of treatment before that as well, which puts an incredible strain. And comparatively, for other parents that have children going through cancer treatment, 9 months is nothing. It's a drop in the ocean. Many of them go through years worth of treatment. So our experience of that in some ways is a lot more kind of condensed than other parents. But we went through a stem cell transplant with Ripley. So that meant that we could only have 4 people that were able to be in contact with her during her recovery from that treatment. And she was a very active 2-year-old. You couldn't just leave her to her own devices. She would constantly want somebody there talking to her and engaging with her and playing games. And she had a really advanced language for 2, so she could hold a whole conversation with you, which was really helpful in some ways, but it's also very exhausting. So what we found was, even during that time, we didn't have much time together because you were passing, so you would see each other for an hour or 2 in the hospital before you switched around, because only one of you could stay overnight. And then afterwards, we both grieved in, and still are grieving in, very different ways. After Ripley died in the hospice, we were both with her when she died. But my husband very much wanted to, once she died, that was it for him. She'd gone and there wasn't anything else to be done. Whereas for me, I spent that whole next week with her because I wanted to prepare her body and wash her and dress her and do all of those things, because to me there was still an element of care that needed to be given. And kind of an extension of that, we've both done our grief in very different ways since. I've wanted to very much keep doing things that link me with Ripley, whereas my husband finds that really hard. So I would like to do those things together, but that's not how he's grieving, and that makes it very difficult to try and work out as a couple what you do and how you manage that, because you're both have very heightened emotions and you're both triggering for each other, because we had a very traumatic journey before we got to her death as well. So yeah, it definitely has an impact.
Yeah, and everybody grieves differently, but we very, very often find that couples do grieve differently, and that does make it very difficult for them to be able to accept where the other person is in their grief. Has that shown up in the research, Jeanette?
Yes, it has, very much so. And also, one of the things that seems to have made a big difference in terms of people's perceptions of the quality of care that they received after the child has died is the level of respect shown for the child by the healthcare practitioners, but also by funeral directors. So having the child in a nice comfy bed, in nice surroundings, with a teddy, in their pajamas that they are used to, not somewhere cold, and then also taking account of what the child liked. So when they had when the funeral is being organised, sort of not having a kind of very adult style funeral. There was one mum who said that she was worried about the funeral directors and her little boy being left in the funeral directors overnight, because it's in the middle of town, in a place where there are lots of drunk people coming out of the pubs, and she just felt worried about him being there. And I think really taking account of that and honouring it and giving people's feelings the respect that they need, that made such a difference in terms of people's experiences.
And giving parents the chance to continue parenting their child after death.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what I think what you were saying, Fiona, with Ripley, the fact that it was just so important to you for you to actually be there, because you are still her mum, and the ability to actually parent her was just so important for you, and that's something that's shared with a lot of our participants as well.
I was going to say that I really got that, Fiona, and I think that being able to spend time with your child after they've died, to bathe them, to dress them, it's unthinkable, but it's so important, and we need support to do that. And I remember choosing clothes for Josh and thinking, I can't be doing this. I don't know, it drives you out of your mind with brokenheartedness and grief, but actually every step along the way, the pain that you experience, I've discovered, strengthens you in the future. And though I'm not saying that, I'm not trying to make it okay, I am saying that it is hopeful if you can tolerate the pain, because physically or psychologically it will out if you don't address it. And I suppose we have to find safe forums, whether it's peer groups, whether it's retreats, whatever it is. One of the mums in our film said that after her daughter died, she went and sat at her daughter's grave with an umbrella whenever it rained to stop the rain falling on her. And she wanted to end her life. She couldn't see a future, but yet she told me recently that she has never seen the grass looking greener, and she's never seen the sky looking bluer. Now, I'm not saying that's what a lot of people feel, but however, she actively tried to take her life, and the only thing that stopped her was the fact that she had another child, and she's so glad she didn't. So finding the right support, talking about the unthinkable, dressing your children, doing whatever it is you have to do, and finding the right people to be alongside you is more important than anything. And I'm sure, Fiona, you must relate to that.
Yeah, and I think it was Jeanette that was saying about the kind of how people interact afterwards. And one of the things that really sticks with me is one of the nurses at the hospice came into the room. I think it was to sort out a problem with the air conditioning or something in the room, but everything she was doing, she was talking to Ripley and explaining it as though Ripley was still there. And at the time I thought, that's a bit odd. Why are you talking to her? She clearly can't hear you. But she explained that she kind of explained to me, well, I'm still talking to her. She's still in the room. I still want to acknowledge that she's here. And actually, looking back on it, that was really helpful, because had she come in and just ignored that Ripley was there, that would have felt awful. I wouldn't have kind of understood that at the time. But just that, it was such a simple thing of, right, Ripley, I'm just going to sort this out above your head, like the nurses would do when you're in the hospital. It just made it so much more normal.
That's really special, isn't it? That's really, very touching. And I know that for Josh's friends, creating a funeral for him, for which we made another film, Beyond Goodbye, was really important, because they didn't get to say goodbye. And as it is with COVID, a lot of people aren't getting to say goodbye, but you can say goodbye a long time after someone's died, which is a strange thought, isn't it? But all Josh's young friends, who were 22 at the time, said, we can't do this. We don't know. We need to take your lead. And we said, you can do it. And they said, but if we upset you, we said, you won't upset us. And his celebration of life, his funeral, was so full of laughter. And they all said it was the first time for many of them they'd ever considered that they might die or a friend might die. And somehow they felt better, and they were ashamed. They said, I'm really sorry, but I feel better. And I'd said, and Jimmy said, and Josh's brother and sister said, thank goodness. Thank goodness you can talk to him in the present. They would touch his coffin, they would, it was hands-on. And I think what Fiona's saying is very similar. You need to get alongside, but a lot of people don't know how to do that, and we need to guide people. To be more.
And I'm very mindful there, Jane, that you're describing really exactly what Fiona was talking about, that when Ripley died, she had to care for other people's emotions as well, which is very hard at that time, isn't it? And that feeling of hopelessness that often comes upon people, to be having to look after other people at the same time is very, very difficult. I wonder whether, Sarah and Jeanette, whether you have found that there is some guidance and some language that you can offer to professionals when they are caring for the children who have died.
I think it's very difficult to give sort of categorical, this is the language you should use, because that will depend very much on the parents themselves. I mean, we've been speaking a little bit this morning about using the word dead even, and actually that acknowledgement of your child is dead. For some parents that is absolutely what is necessary, and for others that's something that they're not at the stage where they could even countenance hearing that language. So I'd say probably just taking the lead from the parents. And I think what we found mostly in our interviews, it's not necessarily so much what is said, but it's how it's said, and the time and the space that you give to parents to have these conversations. So we found a lot that parents in the sort of immediate aftermath of their child's death, they are just not in a mental, emotional, psychological space where they can hear kind of lengthy or complex information about what needs to happen next, or why this has happened, or anything like that. So healthcare professionals, or anyone who's sort of working with the bereaved, needs to be very sensitive to that, and maybe really consider whether that information needs to be given in that moment, or whether it can be kind of portioned out into slightly smaller chunks and sort of extended. And I think as well that a lot of the parents, they say, look, we do remember specific things that have been said, but we remember the awful things, the really insensitive things, the really kind of, the times when it was really clear that the people we were speaking to just didn't care, and they just didn't even want to think about how best to present it. But that most of the time they remember, when they think of good care that they received, they don't really remember exactly what was said. It's more that they remember being given time and space, and having that space held for them to feel everything that they needed to feel in that moment, with no shame or judgment or taboo or anything like that. So I can't really answer that sort of, is there any specific language that should be used, because it's more about following the lead of the parents and giving that time and space for the parents to kind of to work with their own grief, I would say. Jeanette, would you agree with me there?
Absolutely,
misrepresent
yes.
us.
No, that's right. But and another thing is also remembering to explain things that may not be obvious. There was one mum's words stuck with me. She said that she was given a memory box by one of the nurses. She had no idea what was in the memory box. There was no explanation of what it was and why it was there. And she just said she had it on the dining room table for weeks because she didn't dare go near it or open it, because she thought it might have a little boy's clothes in it or something in it that might, she might not be ready to see. And just that taking time to explain to people what's going on and what things are for and why. I think that came out as well.
Jane, oh, sorry.
Go on. I was just going to say that I think that when you're bereaved, you're so tired, you're so exhausted, you're so traumatized that you have to preserve your energy. And I would say that the thing I've learned more than anything else is be careful who you talk to, be careful who you share with. Choose people who can cope so that you don't spend your time making it okay for them. I remember in the early days after Josh died, the effort it took to make it okay for people was exhausting, and you don't know that to begin with. So find peer support groups like the wonderful Compassionate Friends, or the Good Grief Project, or Ripples of Compassion. There's groups out there, there's so many people doing amazing things, but preserve your energy, because frankly you're running on empty, and you might run on adrenaline and cortisol for the first year or even 2 years, but that is going to fade away, and physical and mental ill health takes over for so many people who become agoraphobic, claustrophobic. They get gut problems, physical ailments, broken hearts, pain in their chest. Grief is beyond language, and maybe that's why we make films sometimes. Using film can in a way allow people to walk in the shoes of other bereaved parents in the way that sometimes language doesn't allow.
And Jane, sorry, Sarah, go on.
I was just going to say, we found exactly what you said about broken hearts. We had a lot of parents talking about, being brokenhearted, but not just kind of, oh yeah, we're brokenhearted. It was like, we are literally brokenhearted. This literally hurts. We are literally broken. And it's not a metaphor anymore. This is actually literally what we're going through and what we're feeling. So yes, I think grief is extremely embodied in a way that language, maybe, as you say, Jane, doesn't always represent.
Embodied, and of course, with every bereaved parent has got a level of PTSD. That's not a label that's useless. It's a label that's useful to help people realize why they're having flashbacks, why they can't go to a certain place. PTSD and trauma are hand in hand with the death of a child of any age. And we're not talking about children, we're talking about any age, because everyone is somebody's child. And the trauma ricochets around and manifests itself in so many ways that people think they're going out of their mind. And when you say that's PTSD or that's trauma, they go, oh, well, thank goodness.
Yes.
And I would agree with you, Jane, that it can be really helpful. But listening to both of you, you have been able to use your skills in making films and also as a psychotherapist, and have been able to return to working in that way. And also, Fiona, you've obviously been, you were saying that you have returned to work. So I wonder what has given you or helped you to have the strength to be able to do those things.
I think for me, similar to kind of echoing what Jane was saying there, I've got training in a mental health background, so I'm qualified as an occupational therapist, but I experienced flashbacks for some of the early bits of my grief. And if I didn't have the training and knowledge that I had as a professional to know how to ground myself and do all of those things, I don't know how I would have got through that bit, because if I didn't have that knowledge, there was nobody there to tell me it. And that's where Ripples of Compassion came from, because I was able to get the support that I needed, because I was able to recognise actually this is trauma and I've done all I can do to support it, but I need somebody else to help me. Whereas if you haven't got that knowledge, it's really difficult to do. And then on top of that, there's the process of actually being able to try and get the support, which isn't easy. It doesn't always exist depending on where you are in the country. And it's about making that as easy as possible, because for me that was really an uphill battle. And again, if I didn't have the knowledge of how to access the systems and what to say, I wouldn't have got the support that I needed. So I think it's a really, really difficult thing.
I'm very glad that you were able to get that support, and in particular getting support when it's required for post-traumatic stress can be very difficult in different parts of the country. You know, we do need to do a great deal more in order to make that readily available to people. I wonder, though, how you have, in being able to continue with going back to work and getting back into supposedly normal life. I wonder how you've been able to continue to have those very important bonds with your children.
So continuing bonds is at the heart of everything we do, actually, as at the Good Grief Project. And being active and creative is a lifesaver, but continuing bonds is the essence of our approach, actually, our family's approach to grief, because my kids' siblings are so often the forgotten mourners. They don't feel they've got a language. They've lost their parents in a way, because their parents are so brokenhearted. They're looking, they're worried, they're watching, they can't express their grief. And my daughter said, Mum, everyone asks how you are, but they never ask how I am. And I felt really sad about that. And I think it's really important to just recognise that continuing bonds is about folding a child into your heart and carrying them forward. You don't get over the death of a child. You learn to live with it. And if anyone asks me if I found closure, well, I'm not going to tell you what I'd say back to them, because I've found openings, but no, I'm not going to say it, but it's not helpful. It's a dirty C word. So continuing bonds is about the knowledge that you won't forget your child. I'm sure Fiona would get this. You never forget them. You love your child forever. And when they die, you don't stop loving them. I love Josh with my heart and soul, but I folded him into a place in my heart. It's 10 years this January, where he's part of my life. It doesn't matter where I am, he's with me. And I'm with that. And I think my kids feel the same way because we've spoken openly.
And
I think one of the most helpful things that someone has said to me, I think it was when we were at hospice still, or one of very early on after the grief, was that the grief is your expression of love for your daughter. So the love that you have hasn't disappeared, and that grief is your expression of love. It's just that it's going to be different now. The love hasn't gone, it's just changed. And that was one of the most helpful things for me, I think, in that very early bit, was understanding that actually the grief is okay because the grief is my love. And it's okay to feel this.
And can you tell us a little bit more about Ripples of Compassion and the work of that organisation?
Yeah, so we support children with cancer and life-limiting conditions as well as bereaved parents, but my focus and our kind of initial setup was around the bereavement, and we specifically focused on parents, though we do offer support for siblings and families if there's a request, mainly because it's come from our experience and we didn't have any other children, and we found there was very little out there for parents that didn't have other children, because a lot of the support that we had through the hospital and hospice was family orientated. So it was very difficult for us to go to those events because there were other children there, and all the children were really hard for us to be around. So we wanted to be able to create a space where you could have that space. You didn't have any other children without worrying about other children being there and kind of triggering you in any way, but also to allow parents that did have other children space and time to prioritise themselves and not have to worry about looking after the siblings, because actually it's important to have that time for you as well. So we offer the bereavement therapy, and we offer that at any point after the child has died, immediately all the way up to however many years later, because different people need that support at different times. And the important bit for me was that there is no time limit on that. You can access that support for as long as is needed. There isn't a time limit on grief, so why would you put a time limit on how long you can access that support for? And those are the two key bits for us, and that we can match somebody up with a counsellor or a therapist that they actually get on with and can understand them, because you could be the best therapist in the world, but if you don't have the connection with the parent, it's not going to do anything whatsoever. So in terms of our therapy, those are the kind of core components that we set up around that. And then we've kind of offered additional stuff. So we provide self-care boxes for parents that includes various activities. They have mindfulness activities, they've got pampered stuff, we put a packet of tissues in, and they have a little poem that goes with that to explain what each of the things in the box is for, and to personalise it to include the name of their child as well. And we can offer those at any point to a parent. We do kind of one a year, but we prefer to do them around at a time that's going to be particularly difficult for the parents, that they're likely to need that extra little bit of TLC, or to know that somebody else is thinking of them, or it's okay for them to take time out. I still take a week off work each year around, this week around the anniversaries of Ripley's death and funeral, because I need to give myself that time and space that I don't want to do anything, I don't have to do anything, and I can just sit and do whatever I need to do. And our kind of self-care boxes are a reminder to parents that it's okay to have that space and time. You don't have to keep on with kind of that normal life all of the time. It's okay to retreat in and for everything to be rubbish and to just stay in bed all day.
And I think what you're both saying about, the fact that this is something that doesn't go away, and so people may need support very much further on down the line, depending upon what's happening in their lives, is really important. And Jane, I'm wondering how old your other children were when Josh died. I know we see children up to the age of 25, and very often for young adults, it can be quite difficult for them to get the support they need.
Yeah, absolutely. My daughter was 18. She was in the middle of her A-levels. And my stepson Joe is 10 years older than Josh. But, he went into a serious depression, really, really bad. He didn't know what to do. He didn't know where to go. And of course, he discovered what we all discover, that there's very few choices. So we're back to the idea that you have to find what works for you. And for some people, actually going back to work, to go back to what Roseleen was saying earlier, can actually be really helpful. Carrying on with what you did before, because people will project stuff onto you. I remember someone saying to me, "You'll never work again, will you? Because how can you go back to work after you've lost your child?" And I said, "Well, really?" And it's another level of grief. I went back to work quite quickly, and work was a respite for me. And it meant that I could manage being with my other kids. I could manage to be with my friends. I could go to work, and as long as I worked less hours, with more support and a team that were prepared to learn, though they did ask me to teach them how to support me. This is a therapist environment. But, working and structure can be so helpful.
I think it's very important, really, that people do not feel that hopelessness is going to continue, that life does go on, and it's not the same. Life becomes the new normal rather than what it was before. And Jeanette, you're nodding there. I wonder what your research has uncovered.
Yeah, that was echoed so much in the parents we spoke to, about how, like Jane was saying, you absorb your child into you and it becomes part of you and you move on with it, but you're a different person. You're not the same person that you were before. And you don't want people to kind of treat you as if you were. You want to move on and be different and acknowledge what's happened. And we also found a lot of people, the bereavement did strange things to people's perceptions of time, people's experiences of time, like a bit like what Fiona was saying. Time would like stretch out and something would seem like an eternity, even though it's just a few minutes, or things would just fly by. And so time wouldn't behave itself in a kind of normal way. And also people would also say that they kind of would almost step right outside the timeline. So the world is carrying on without them and they're kind of like outside it, kind of dealing with grief in their own way. I don't know, with Jane and Fiona, this is the sort of similar things with you. And a lot of parents we spoke to said this. So they need to be given that time.
We featured that very much in the film A Love That Never Dies. Time stood still. But other people's lives carried on, and we would have left behind in a different time frame, because time doesn't heal, really it accommodates. And I think that's something that is a bit of a secret. People don't know that. So time has to be really unpicked, and stressed and accommodated.
And something that we've been finding during this COVID time is that many of the families are feeling, well, the rest of the world is like we are now, and that has a strange sort of comfort to it for some families. For others, the isolation becomes even greater and more difficult. I wonder, Fiona, about the concept of time and how it's impacted upon you and upon Ripley's dad as well.
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of bits in there. So I think even now we'll still find that kind of something like a film coming out. We're like, well, we'd have absolutely seen that film. How has this escaped our attention that we didn't realise this film was out? And then you'll look at when the film came out and you go, oh, well, that was 2018, and that year's just a blur. So that's why we didn't notice.
Yes.
And we keep finding things like that where we go, well, why didn't we know about this? Oh, it happened in this year and everything was a blur and we were just kind of getting through. But I think the other thing for me and that my husband's found as well is that it has really affected our memories, not just in terms of kind of that sense of time, which obviously impacts on the memory, but even in terms of our kind of working memory and what we're capable of doing and kind of retaining that information. And even now, I can see a huge difference with what I was able to do before we went into hospital with Ripley at work. I could just keep all of the things in my head. Whereas now, if I don't write something down, it's not happening. And I've had to develop ways of coping with that. And it's really hard to explain to people that that memory, that is part of my grief, that's part of the kind of traumatic experience that I've been through. And that is different. I'm not necessarily, I can find ways to work around that, but I'm not going to get that back. I'm not going to go back to that way of functioning that I was before. And that's been really hard to try and explain to people. We found we had to constantly remind people, well, we haven't remembered that because you told it to us once and we've not written it down. And I think that goes back to Jeanette, what you were saying about explaining things to parents in that very early stage, is if you can back something up with writing it down or giving it to parents in a physical way, because you're not necessarily going to remember everything that you're told. I know that we did loads of things in that week at the hospital in terms of registering her death and preparing a funeral. I couldn't tell you anything about how we did them. I've got no idea. The only things I can tell you are the things that either I've written down because I've used kind of writing, whereas James used film, I've used writing and kind of writing poetry specifically to try and find a way to express some of those things. But yeah, without that, I think that the memory and the time are just entirely different.
Yeah.
And certainly that's something that, we're always doing, is directing people to the information and the information sheets and the videos that are on our website, because, there's some permanent information there that may be helpful to them. I wonder whether, Jeanette and Sarah, whether you've found other things that are helpful to parents when they're grieving for their child.
I think again it's the same answer I gave before. Really, it's very, very individual. Certainly the idea of having information in writing can be very helpful, so long as this is also backed up with a verbal explanation, because for some parents there was nothing worse than just being given a ton of leaflets and just told, here is your support, phone these numbers, do all of the work yourself. So I think there does need to be a balance, and of course different people appreciate having information in different ways, so again following the lead of the parents on that. I think certainly the ideas of sort of having that time and space and it being normalized, telling parents that they are not going to be functioning exactly as you and Jane were saying, and Fiona, that, you're not going to be, just don't expect of yourself the same things that you would have been expecting from yourself before the bereavement. And normalizing this idea of giving yourself time, I think, maybe this ties into the general sort of the taboos around grief and bereavement and just pain in general in our society, but the idea of taking time off work to manage or to give yourself that time, I think it's still in many people kind of frowned upon, or people don't feel that they're able to do that because they sort of think, well, I'm not sick, I'm not contagious, why can't I not carry on? But actually that's so important, that actually you do need to give yourself that time. So I think encouraging that as well, normalizing that. Jeanette, was there anything? Sorry, Fiona.
I was going to say, I think about the time off work, it's about the employers understanding that as well, because I've changed jobs since Ripley died, because I found that actually the first time I went back to work, there wasn't that understanding. So when I was saying, I need this time, I'm going to take it out of my annual leave, I'm going to have this time off, there was pressure of, well, what do you need that time for? Why can't you just carry on? And I was like, no, this is what I need. And I think there's a lot around employers being understanding and of what parents' needs are, and that's going to be different, and that it's okay for them to have that time. And I've changed jobs so that I've got an employer that's able to support that. But when I first went back, that made that whole experience a lot harder and a lot more traumatic than it needed to be, because I felt like I had to fight to get something that should have just been given to me. Should have just been a given that I would be allowed time off for anniversaries and birthdays and days so that I could do that grief.
It's great that the government have now allowed there to be some bereavement leave. It maybe is not as much as we would like it to be, but it's a start and it's a movement in the right direction. What was that like for you, Jane? Because you said that work was something that you found was really helpful.
Yeah.
Did you need to take some time as well before you went back to work?
Absolutely. I needed to take time. I needed to get some therapy. I needed some peer support from, I found out about the Compassionate Friends. But I think something that's really important as well is you need to express your anger when you've lost a child. And that's not something that you want to take back to work with you. That has to be compartmentalized. Now, people think that if you're dignified and silent, you're a good griever. Well, I would challenge that. Grief is messy, indigestible, awful, and that every one of us bereaved parents have to be badly behaved some of the time and be forgiven for it. Now, I think, and I don't know if Fiona would agree, there's very little forgiveness around that, because people take it on they take it personally. They think that your anger is aimed at them. They don't realize your anger is actually about your failure to keep your child alive, to make them better, to stop that accident happening, to why did they take their life, whatever it is. So I think it's really important to fold that into the conversation about the death of a child. Anger needs to have a place to be expressed. It's not all dignified and silent. I mean, I can be dignified and silent 90% of the time these days, but in the early days of my grief, I was a bit of a nightmare. Not at work, I was very well behaved in the workplace. But I think most bereaved parents, I don't know if you feel that, Fiona, or maybe you're just an exemplary human being and never got angry.
I think it comes at different points. So I think where we'd had such a journey with Ripley before she died, my feelings were probably different, and my initial feelings were just relief that we didn't have to keep going through that anymore, and that she didn't have to keep going through that. So it took me a while before I got to the anger, because I had that kind of relief, and thank goodness that whole journey has finished for a little while. That was kind of a nice feeling, but also delayed getting to that angry bit. And then when the angry bit came, it was very angry. Possibly because it taken a little while to get there. But yeah, I think it comes at different points. And it's also what I tried to do in the early days was foresee what all the triggers would be. So there are some obvious things that you know are going to be triggers, like the anniversaries or birthdays or Christmas or special occasions. But there are so many triggers that it's impossible to know what they all are. And I found that I've walked through town and then I've just kind of stopped dead in my tracks, because I've gone, I haven't been here since I was here with Ripley. And it just suddenly hits you all at once. And you can't prepare for all of those triggers. And I spent so long trying to, and controlling everything to try and make it safe in that very early bit. Whereas now I'm in a place where I go, I'm never going to be able to understand what all of those triggers are. And I can just accept that there are going to be times when something is just going to hit me out of nowhere, and actually that's okay. And it's taken a while to get there, but I think that's something that's really important to kind of understand, is that you're not going to know what's going to trigger a parent. And films in particular we found really hard, because I found it particularly difficult, not necessarily if a child had died in a film, but if it was used as a plot device and it wasn't necessary. I found it really, really hard. And we found there's a website, Does the Dog Die, that lists all the triggers on it for different, it has a whole host of triggers, not just around death. But we found that we have to check every film before we watched it to see, actually, is it okay to watch this film? Because I'm so fed up of getting halfway through and having to put a film down because it's triggered me in some way.
That's very interesting, because people were always terrified. A lot of bereaved parents were always terrified to step into the cinema in the days before COVID to see our film, because they were terrified it would make them feel worse. And of course, stepping across that line into the cinema is part of the move forward, because we made our film, every part of our film is about trying to be hopeful, trying to say there is life after the death of a child. It may be an agonizing journey, but these parents have all survived. And it's been messy, and it's been angry, and it's been indigestible, but it's hopeful. So crossing the line is something that I would say to non-bereaved people, do it. Us bereaved parents cross the line all the time, every day, as I'm sure Fiona would agree. But the non-bereaved people are the people I want to watch A Love That Never Dies. I want them to say, oh, this film might make me feel a bit depressed, I'm not going to go and see it. I'd like them to say, I might go and see that because I might be able to support my bereaved friend down the road a little bit better.
That sounds right. I think I found a similar thing to you, Jane, with where I've written poetry, and some of that I have shared through our charity and online. And one of them is, it's quite a long poem, but it's our journey from diagnosis all the way through to Ripley dying and that period afterwards. And it's about trying to get people to understand and what that experience is like, and actually put yourself in someone else's shoes. So I think it was, we were talking earlier about just sitting with the parents and being able to tolerate those feelings. And what I found quite hard is if other people can't tolerate my grief, or other people can't tolerate the idea that my daughter has died, how am I supposed to tolerate that as a bereaved parent, as someone that's directly linked to it? So having people that are able to just sit there and go, yes, this is absolutely awful, it's horrible, and stay with that has been the most helpful thing. And I think some of the most helpful things people have said, I think Sarah was saying earlier, is there isn't anything I can say to make this better, but I'm here.
Yeah.
And actually then being there and not running away.
Agree, and staying there for the journey. And if people can't stay for the journey, then they need to be able to say, I can't cope, I don't think I can support you, rather than turning it around on you and, you know, projecting it onto you. Because maybe myself and Fiona are in agreement here that the biggest gift you can give, and we've been in agreement all the way through, by the way, the biggest gift you can give a bereaved parent is to actually challenge your own fear of us and what we represent, because we are not bereaved parents, we are people who have lost a child, and we don't want to be pathologized, don't want to be kind of, if you like, put in a box. So get alongside us. If you can't cope, just move away. If you can cope, ask us, what can I do to help? And maybe I could just sit and listen. I don't have a magic wand. So you can say, well, there isn't one, but thank you so much for sitting with me and tolerating my bad moods or my broken heart or my sad eyes that make you feel bad. Thank you for having the courage to get alongside me, because that makes me feel sane.
Yeah, one of the mums that we talked to, she said that she put a brave face on it a lot of the time, and people would congratulate her on her strength and her courage. And she said that was the worst thing, because she didn't want to feel that she had to be strong and courageous, because she didn't feel like that all the time. But she just felt like people saying that made her feel she had to carry on being like that, and it wasn't helpful.
And that she could maybe maintain it for very, very specific points, but then she would be told, oh, you're so strong, you're so brave, you know, you're an easy griever, you know, we don't need to do too much work with you because you've got this. And she just wanted to scream, you know, like, no, I haven't actually got this, you know, I'm not strong or brave, I'm just living, you know, trying to survive. So I think that's, exactly as you say, Jeanette, just sort of, you know, from one piece of advice for healthcare workers, you know, one of the really sort of categorical things that our parents said, or one of them, don't tell us we're strong or brave. Just don't.
And I would really echo that, because actually from my perspective, I haven't had a choice in this. I can't be strong or brave because I haven't chosen to be in the situation that I'm in. If I had a choice in it, obviously I wouldn't have chosen it. So I'm not brave. I am just doing. I have no choice but to do what I'm doing to keep living. And I would definitely echo that parent.
People say, "Oh, I would die if my child died." You think, well, actually, you can't just die.
Yeah.
You can't just die. I mean, you can, but you can't. And if you have other children, or even if you don't have other children, it's not helpful. I think we have to have people believe that we can survive and that they can survive. It's really important. Otherwise, we feel so marginalized and so alone, and so there's no normality. You know, we represent this awful COVID type thing, you know, the mask. I mean, it's all happening right now, and a lot of people are experiencing this maybe for the first time. You know, and I remember in our film A Love That Never Died, somebody said, one of our contributors said, she was ashamed to say that after 9/11, she thought that it was something that was really helpful for her to know that there were a load of other people out there who'd woken up that day and, like her, were bereaved, like her, had lost their child or their partner, and that she wasn't alone in the world. And she felt bad for saying it, but that loneliness is at the heart of the discomfort that the bereaved feel. All the bereaved, I think. And we're all bereaved in one way or another, I think. Right now, this is tough.
It is indeed. And And when you were talking about feelings, Jane, feelings of anger, of course, there are so many other feelings that come into the grieving process and that go round and come back again. It's as though there's a spiral of feelings that, that keep returning. For many people, it's difficult for them to be able to express those. I wonder, Jeanette and Sarah, whether there is any way that people can be helped with the language that we use for them to be able to do that.
I think a lot of the people we talked to used quite a lot of like metaphorical language, but as Sarah was saying, it's kind of metaphorical on one of it, but it's also literal. So a lot of people talking about feeling broken or feeling like their world is like literally fallen apart, and it's kind of giving, I think it's paying full attention to those words when someone is saying their world has fallen apart. It's not just like, an idiom or a cliche thing. It literally has fallen apart.
Yeah.
And taking that on board, I think those kinds of ways of talking about it just got across the magnitude of what people are going through, and it's listening to that and then kind of acknowledging it and using that kind of language back. I think. I don't know, Sarah, would you agree with that? Or...
Yeah, definitely. And I wonder as well if there's actually scope. I'm sort of going off research a little bit here because I'm going off piste. But I wonder if there's scope for caregivers and bereavement support workers to actually build a slightly more creative element into their care, where they say, if you had to express what this felt like, if you had to, I don't know, draw it or something, what would you draw? If you had to explain it to me in words, what would you say? Because I think, language, when we're talking, when we're just communicating normally, just sort of in everyday life, we use so much kind of, so many of these sort of idioms, these cliches, that we use because we know that we will be understood. But of course, the problem is when you've gone through something like this, these cliches take on new meaning, but that the people you use them with don't understand that when you say, oh, I'm heartbroken, no, you're heartbroken. And when your world's fallen apart, no, it actually has fallen apart. This isn't the kind of thing that you say when you've had a bad day. This is real. So maybe we need to maybe there's scope for exploring some ways in which we could sort of shake up the language a little bit. And
absolutely, Sarah. I think that creativity is really important when people are grieving, in order to be able to express their grief and in order to be able to heal to some extent. Just listening to Jane and Fiona has been writing poetry, Jane has been making films. These are terribly important, and as human beings, we are creative people. And so finding the right idiom for each person to be able to express what is happening to them, I think is really, really important.
And really listening.
Yeah.
Really listening.
The retreats that we run for bereaved parents are creative and active grief retreats, and we give parents the opportunity to write, to take photographs, to box, to cook. And my daughter produces the most beautiful food because good food is sustaining. My son does personal training, he does boxing. We have someone else who does breathworks and yoga. The parents who all arrive, we have a creative writing workshop leader, but all the parents who arrive tend to say, I can't. And it's a bit like grief. When your child dies, we all say, I know I said, I don't know if you said, Fiona, I can't find my way through this. I can't do it. I failed. My son has died. I didn't do my job. It wasn't my fault. It wasn't his fault. But I failed. So when people cross the threshold into a new experience, they're taking such a courageous move, and I think we need to facilitate that in whatever way. So even taking part in a conversation like this, which we're all nervous about, we might not seem to be, but we're all nervous. I might not seem nervous, but I am. We have to cross the threshold. We can do it. And like all the parents who come on our active and creative grief retreats, we say, just try. You don't have to even do anything. And by the end of the weekend, they are so proud, and the feedback and the love and the recognition of continuing bonds is like, yes, however much hard work it is to run a retreat, you know why you've done it, because at the end of that retreat, the parents say to you, I can do this. Tiny steps, one breath at a time.
And being with other people who understand what they're going through is, I think, also really, really helpful. And so, you know, that's a, you know, a really helpful thing for people when they are trying to make sense of everything that has happened to them. I'm wondering if perhaps it might be timely now for us to just each say something that we think is really important for parents who have experienced the death of their child. And maybe, Jeanette, if we can start with you.
Yeah, I would say just don't feel guilty about whatever feelings you have, and whatever way you want to express the grief, to go with it, and it's natural, and there'll be other people who are there to support you, I think.
And Sarah?
While this is obviously a real kind of seismic change in your life, and that you will never go back to the way you were before, that you are still a parent and they are still your child, and whatever you need to do to enact that bond and to keep them alive in your heart, then you should do that, and you should find people who can support you in that, and people who will talk about your child and say their name and see you as their parent. I think that would be my number one.
And Fiona?
Yeah, I think the key for me is that you're not alone, that there are other people that are going through and have gone through similar experiences to you. It won't be the same because nobody's grief is identical, but there are other people that can understand, and that there is hope, and that hope varies at different points. And sometimes you will be able to feel that hope all the time, and even at points years later, you will still have dark bits where the hope disappears, but that it always comes back. And to use whatever is meaningful to you, like Sarah was saying, to find that connection, so that you can continue that. And as I said, I think earlier on, that the most helpful thing that someone said to me was that my grief is the expression of love for my daughter. And that really helped. If you are grieving, it's because you loved them, and they know that you loved them, and that love doesn't go away just because they've died.
And Jane?
Maybe it's not about how our children died, it's about how they lived, and that I want to remember the 22 years that I had Josh in my life. I was very lucky to have him for 22 years. I wish it could have been longer, and I know for Fiona it was a lot shorter, but you know, the time you have with your children will stay with you forever. And Josh has taught me so much in his 22 years that has changed me fundamentally, maybe for the better, and I miss him every day.
Yeah. And of course, the loss of the death of a child is one of the most difficult things that anybody, or the most difficult thing that anybody ever has to go through in life. And I would just say that although it sometimes takes a lot of bravery to reach out for support, just to do that, to pick up the phone and to find one of the organisations that offer support, because they will be there for you and they will help you to get through this.